You know what they say? They say that big baits catch big fish. And you know what they also say? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, you know what ain't broke and comes in big sizes? A soft plastic worm. Now, I feel like most of us out there are confident in throwing this smaller, normal sized soft plastic worms, and that's totally okay and fine, but I want to challenge you to do more. In this video, I'm going to break down the giant soft plastic worm for every type of angler, from beginner to advanced, from the bank to the bass boat, and hopefully give you guys some confidence on how to catch fish in a brand new way. My name's Tyler, and let's talk about it. Another giant, another giant. Look at that, y'all. I can't believe what I just caught. Yes! Well, how's it going, folks? Welcome back to TRF. My goal here on this channel is to help you guys become better anglers and catch more fish. And so if that's what you want, hit that subscribe button. So what qualifies as a big worm? In my opinion, and from what I see around the fishing industry, that mark is 10 inches. So your standard Senko style worm is gonna be 5 to 6 inches. Your standard curly tail is usually 6 to 8 inches. None of those, in my opinion, and for the sake of this video, qualify as a big worm. Now, does the worm need to have a curly tail in order to qualify for a big worm? Not necessarily. In this video, we're gonna talk about both curly tail worms and straight tail worms, how to rig both of them, and where the best places to throw both of them are. So let's begin by talking about the why of soft plastic worms as an entire category. Now, why do bass eat a worm like this cutter worm right here, or really any worm? I have absolutely zero clue. A worm looks nothing like the main forage of any body of water, at least to my knowledge out there, so it's definitely not a match the hatch sort of thing. I believe that it is just as simple as the fish has got to eat, and anything that looks edible, they're gonna eat. I mean, heck, a soft plastic worm looks edible enough to me. Now that we've covered that, let's discuss the why of the big worms. So why do bass eat a big soft plastic worm, especially over a small one? Well, I believe it is because it looks like it's an easy meal, and it's perceived, at least by the fish until they get hooked, that it is full of nutrients and good for them. The way that all forms of wildlife get bigger is by eating more food and having to move and work less in order to get it, especially when it comes to humans. Fat people would not be nearly as fat if they had to travel across town via bicycle in order to eat the next slice of cake. Bass are the exact same way. They cannot survive and get big if they are consistently moving around too much to have to find and eat food. They would rather eat more food in one location and call that their home. That will get them nice, fat, and healthy. So that is why big lures oftentimes catch big fish, because the big fish are big for a reason. They've learned to eat a lot of food, and when they see a lot of food in their face, they want to eat it. So now that we understand the why of worms and big worms, let's talk about the what. What types of big worms do we have? First, we've got the curly tail. Imagine a big old United States flag or even a woman's veil at a wedding. Imagine the wind blowing through that, and the faster the wind blows, the more that fabric waves back and forth. That's exactly what happens to a curly tail worm, also known as a ribbon tail worm, in the water. You reel that thing, you hop it back to the boat, back to the bank, and that ribbon tail is vibrating back and forth in the water, creating vibration and pushing water. And the other category of big worm is going to be the straight tail. Imagine taking a Senko, adding 4 to 6 inches onto it, and then making some parts slender and some parts thick. That is a giant straight tail worm. So what is each one of these worms good for? Well, much like almost every other lure in bass fishing, you've got to find what works for you and for your body of water. So take my advice with a grain of salt. This is just what I found to be successful with these two types of big worms and what I've noticed in the professional tournament scene. The curly tail worm is usually better used on a Texas rig or a Carolina rig, which is literally just a Texas rig with a different weight configuration. And the straight tail worm is better on a giant shaky head. Nothing made this more obvious to me than when I watched the 2013 Bassmaster Elite Series professional tournament on Falcon Lake. The amount of big fish caught in that tournament was absurd, and almost all of them came on a big worm. Some on a shaky head, and some a Texas rig or Carolina rig, set up exactly how I've told you. As a matter of fact, it was that exact tournament that made me first start wanting to throw the big worm. Again, you can feel free to rig these worms however you like and whatever you're comfortable with. That's just what I found most pro anglers use, and therefore they fish for a living. I'm gonna do what they do. Now, rigging the worm. Let's talk about the Texas rig with this worm right here and the giant shaky head with this one. So first we have the curly tail worm. What do you need to rig the curly tail worm? Well, first off, you need a Texas rig hook, preferably a 5 or a 6/0. I know, Tyler, that's a big hook. The reason why you need such a big wide gap hook is because, well, this is a big worm, and the hook that fits this worm best is a 5 or a 6/0. Now, do you need a weight? Yes, you do. I like to throw either a 1/16, an 1/8, or a 3/16 ounce weight. I might go up to a quarter or even bigger if I'm throwing this in brush piles, but most of y'all watching do not fish brush piles that often, and so a 1/8 ounce weight like this one right here works perfect. And lastly, do you need to peg your weight? I actually made an entire video about this. My answer, not really if you don't want to. Again, if you're fishing this worm in heavy brush piles and big trees, yes, you should peg your weight. But if you're just throwing this in relatively open brush, open water rocks, you don't need to peg. So you're gonna take your hook, tie it on with whatever knot you like. I tie a Palomar, and then instead of threading it on like a Texas rig about 1/4 to 1/3 of an inch like I do on most worms, I'm gonna go a little bit deeper. I'm gonna go maybe 1/2 an inch to 3/4 of an inch before I turn the hook point back around. That way, the eye is completely buried inside the nose of that worm. And for big worms, I like to have just a little bit more space above that eye. And then you're gonna poke it in just like you do with any other Texas rig. Poke that hook back inside the worm, and you have yourselves a nicely rigged, Texas rigged big worm. This one is simple. Let's talk about one that most people don't throw, and that is the giant shaky head. This here is a giant offshore style shaky head jig head, and this is our Magnum straight tail worm. Like I said, these two, from what I've seen in professional fishing and from what I do personally, these two go together best. Now, as you can see here, there's a screw lock on this shaky head that is intended for your worm to screw onto the head to keep it in place. That way, when a fish bites or you set the hook and the fish only has the tail, this thing doesn't return back to you without your worm. Now, the first thing I like to do is bite or cut off the front part of this worm right here. That way it sits more flushed onto that jig head. So I'm gonna cut off about that much right there, and now we're ready to go. We're gonna take our big 10-inch straight tail worm, shove it down that little point there, and then start to slowly twist, making sure we're keeping that worm as straight as possible onto the screw lock bait keeper. And I like to keep screwing until I have that thing nice and tight, flush against that shaky head. Now here's where the rigging is a little bit different in the way that I do Texas rigs. I'm of course gonna find the place where the hook has a bend right here, pinch that worm, and start to feed that hook down that spot. But instead of poking it all the way through, like I do with a Texas rig, I'm only gonna poke it about halfway through and then start threading my worm down. That way, when the worm gets completely straight, the hook is totally into that worm, but the point is right there on the edge. Y'all can't really see that, but the point, if I was to press down on this like this, boom, there's the point. And like I showed, if you get it right, it is perfectly straight. You have a big enough gap right here for any fish that clamps down to get hooked. And let me tell you, this is an offshore fishing nightmare for big bass. Big bass cannot handle themselves around this big shaky head. And let me tell you, if you want to catch the biggest bass in your brush pile or offshore rock, throw the big straight tail soft plastic worm. Now, when it comes to your gear, your rod, your reel, and your line, what do you need for big soft plastic worms fish deep? This combo right here, the Lose Mach 1, can work. It's a 7.2 medium heavy. But in my experience, with a hook thickness like most wide gap hooks and big shaky heads have, it is incredibly helpful to have a heavy action rod. I love throwing a 7.3 to a 7.6 heavy. That way the longer rod length helps to set the hook on a super long, deep cast. And that heavy power, fast action helps to drive this thick hook out of the soft plastic and into a fish's mouth. And with line, I am almost always throwing 17 or 20 pound fluorocarbon, hardly ever 15 or less. Like I said, it is a thick wire hook with a long cast. There's gonna be stretch, and you're gonna have to have some major power without breaking off. 17 or 20 pound definitely helps with that. So now that we know how to rig the giant soft plastic worm, let's head on the water and see how to retrieve these worms. So when it comes to big worm retrieves, you really have three main retrieves. The first one is going to be your standard Texas rig retrieve that I think is kind of built into everybody's brains when they first pick up a soft plastic worm or a creature bait. And that is just kind of a hop off the bottom, moving your rod tip anywhere from 2 inches to 1.5 feet to get that bait off the bottom a little bit and back to you. And it takes about, I don't know, a minute to get that bait back to the bank or back to the boat. That's your first retrieve. It can work great. The second retrieve is what I call a Carolina rig drag. And that's where you take your rod tip, you lower it, and you drag just barely up. I'm talking just barely above a straight drag sideways. That way it gets the worm's tail moving and gets off the bottom just a few inches before it comes to rest on the bottom again. It is crucial with a big worm after a drag like this to, of course, one, let it get to the bottom. That's commonplace with every soft plastic lure. But second, make sure you're reeling in all of your slack to where the next time you start your drag, you have almost no slack in your line. That way you're pulling on tight line, slack. Let it sit there. You can even reel in your slack as you let it sit on the bottom for a few seconds. You can definitely vary how fast you drag the worm, but that is retrieve number 2. Now the third retrieve is definitely different, and it's something you might not have thought about when retrieving a big worm, and that's what's called a stroke. A stroke is when you take your fishing rod, and instead of doing a short hop, like a traditional Texas rig, you do a fast, big hop, just like that. And what a big stroke accomplishes is it creates a reaction strike for a fish that might be looking at your worm down there, deciding not to eat it until it starts to escape from the bass's reach. That's oftentimes when they will chase it down. Bass are a lot faster than you give them credit for. They will chase down a fast-moving worm and absolutely nail that thing. A stroke is definitely not the most common worm retrieval, but it can work, so make sure you try it out before you give up on the big worm. The last thing to discuss is where to throw your big soft plastic worms. The biggest key for me is staying deep. I have not found much success with both the big straight tail worm or the big curly tail worm when it comes to shallow water. And as a matter of fact, as I've been filming this video over the past few days, I've cast both of these worms in shallow water and watched the bass in these ponds swim away from my worm. I think in shallow water, especially shallow clear water, it's kind of too big of a presence. Again, this is personal anecdote, but I think the fish are more likely to eat something in shallow water that's more finessey, a little finesse worm, soft plastic, fluke, soft plastic creature bait, little swim bait, as opposed to a big worm. These are meant for more deep styles of fishing. And you'll notice in that Bassmaster tournament, those hook sets were some pretty dang big hook sets. That's because those guys were fishing deep and they needed a big, strong, heavy hook set and a longer rod to get those fish out of those brush piles, off those big deep rock piles, and into their boat. But that doesn't mean you have to be a bass boat angler to throw a giant soft plastic worm. You can throw it in ponds as well. Now, if your pond is a max depth of 6 to 7 feet and there's absolutely zero offshore structure, nothing off of the bank besides mud, a big worm might not be the best thing to throw. But if you've got brush piles, if you've got lay down trees that are farther deep into the water, maybe trees that somebody sank or they floated from a flood, or you've got rock piles or cinder blocks or tires that people sunk in the middle of your pond or lake, that is a great place to throw a big worm, especially in the summer. I'm not saying it can't work during other times of the year, but you're gonna see tons of footage throughout the rest of this summer of me throwing big worms offshore to catch the biggest fish in those schools. Getting your big worm in and around those deeper types of structure, again, grass lines, grass edges, brush piles, rock piles, that's where you're gonna find your biggest fish. And just like I started the video by saying, big lures can catch big fish. So to prove to you guys today about the big worm, we've come to a pond that's got what looks like absolutely stagnant water, hardly any wind out here. It is hot as heck. And we're gonna throw our worm into the deepest water we can find, which is right over there, where there's some brush, there might be some rock down there, definitely offshore structure like I talked about. And it's really the only way to catch fish this time of year. I mean, it is hot out here. I would much rather be in my bass boat fishing a brush pile that I know exactly where it is. But I wanted to prove to you guys that big worms work in ponds too. There he is. There he is. Come on. Come on. Gosh. Dang it. Oh, it was a big one. He was running at me so fast. I need a longer rod. That right there is what you don't want to do because you're not going to get many bites during this time of the day. It is noon. It's 100 degrees outside. And that fish was big. Gosh dang, missed opportunity. Man. All right, you big stinkers. Where you at? Get out of here. Big ol' upward drag, let it sink. Little tail's going, and then it glides, and then it glides. And hopefully it goes, glide, smash! There's one. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Boom, bring it in. Bring it in, don't you get stuck. Yes! Let's go! It took a bunch of casts, but I eventually found a good feel and brush pile down there, made a cast, nice 2.5 pound bass. Yes! See you, buddy. I proved it, it works. Well, folks at home, that's gonna do it for our video on the big old plastic worm. If you learned something, let me know in the comment section below, and if you have any video ideas, also put those down in the comments. If y'all have made it all the way to the end of this video, you obviously like the content, so I will leave 2 of my previous videos linked in these corners. This will be how to rig every soft plastic lure, pretty awesome video, and this one will be my jig in ponds how-to masterclass. If you struggle throwing a jig, much like a lot of people struggle throwing a big worm, that video will help you out a ton and give you some confidence. My name's Tyler. As always, it's a pleasure, and we'll see you guys next time right here on TRF.